Hey everyone, this is Todd, the Cybertruck truck guy, and today I want to talk about why I think the Cybertruck is getting ready to turn the automotive industry upside down. In order to do that, we need to take a little bit of a detour back in time and go look not at the automobile industry, but actually at smartphones. Now, when it comes to smartphones, probably most of us can actually remember back to 2007 when the iPhone was released. But when we start having to try and remember further than that, our memories get a little bit sketchy. Now, you might remember the BlackBerry because President Obama actually resisted giving it up once he was elected. But you probably don't remember things like the Palm Pilot or Windows CE or the Trio. Do you remember the Trio? So here's the thing. Despite the fact that a bunch of different companies were working on developing the smartphone for almost 10 years by 2006, the reality is that as of 2006, only 3% of the American mobile phone marketplace was actually dedicated to smartphones. But then by the end of 2007, that number was 6%, doubled, and it continued to skyrocket from that point forward. It's hard to know whether or not the iPhone was actually the catalyst that caused the explosion in smartphones to happen. But what we do know is that prior to the iPhone, the smartphone was basically relegated to something that nerds or business people used. But after the iPhone was released, the smartphone suddenly turned into a piece of technology that everyone wanted to have, and somehow people figured out how to afford it because it went from a luxury item to something they couldn't live without. When you compare the design and aesthetics of the iPhone compared to all the other smartphones out there, there's obviously a level of refinement that the iPhone has that wasn't apparent on any of the other devices. But that said, it would be a mistake to think that it was aesthetics alone that caused the iPhone's meteoric rise. The iPhone introduced three key elements into the equation that hadn't been there before. The first thing it introduced was a multi-touch screen that allowed users to navigate the iPhone with things like the pinch and the stretch feature. The second thing it introduced was a robust phone operating system that allowed users to browse the internet in a way that was very similar to what they were used to on a desktop. And the last thing it offered was its iTunes application, basically allowing you to get rid of your iPod, which had been very popular up to the point, and replace it with your phone and use your phone as a replacement for the iPod. It was really the first glimpse into the way that we would use smartphones as an extension of the ecosystem that we were used to with our computers. It wasn't really a phone, it was really a portable, location-aware, internet-connected computer that could also make phone calls. So, as of today, for more than a decade, automakers around the world, including Tesla, have been trying to crack the code to actually find the EV equivalent of the iPhone. I think EVs are waiting for their iPhone moment, and I think the Cybertruck is that moment. I have 4 reasons that I think the Cybertruck will do for electric vehicles what the iPhone did for smartphones. Reason number 1, an unignorable, iconic design. The design of the iPhone was polarizing, and in doing so, it just couldn't be ignored. Like the iPhone, the Cybertruck will have a polarizing impact on the way we think of how EVs should be designed. Its design is so unique and so recognizable, it's going to permeate popular culture. Also, it's not just designed for design's sake, but it actually flows out of Tesla's philosophy, and it flows out of the utility of the vehicle itself. This combination of a radical design that follows the philosophy and function of the company that designed it allows it to reach far past the small EV enthusiast niche, or even the dedicated truck niche, and go far out into the popular culture. It's going to become part of millions of conversations because it will just start showing up in driveways and neighborhoods and shopping centers and workplaces, and people won't be able to ignore it. People are going to get introduced to EVs because they're going to come face to face with the Cybertruck. Reason number 2, viral sales. I resisted buying an iPhone, And I didn't buy an iPhone because Steve Jobs or Apple persuaded me. It was because of my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law, who also works at the same company I work at, was a Mac enthusiast, and he had been trying to persuade me for 7 years to adopt first a Mac and then a MacBook and then the iPhone when it came along. And I had resisted him at every level. But when the iPhone came out, he kept showing me with every upgrade, every new release, every new iPhone of all the cool and fascinating features it had. And by the time the iPhone 3 came along, I had to get one. So we already know that one of the reasons people buy a Tesla is that someone they know owns a Tesla and they won't shut up about it. So finally, they actually go on a ride with them and then they get hooked. The EV virality is actually going to increase with the Cybertruck for 2 reasons. The first is the radical and polarizing design that I talked about. And number 2 is that Cybertruck sales are going to be geographically spread out over a much wider area than traditional Tesla sales or EV sales have been. As much as the Cybertruck is going to stand out in a place like LA or New York or Chicago, it's going to scream out from places like Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Des Moines, Iowa, and Springfield, Missouri, and Wichita, Kansas, and Louisville, Kentucky, and Little Rock, Arkansas. These aren't places that are used to seeing Ferraris and Lamborghinis or even Teslas. They're used to a pretty narrow palette of pretty boring vehicles. When the Cybertruck shows up in those places, it's going to be like a Hollywood star showing up in those places. The Cybertruck's presence in all these communities, in places that really hadn't thought much about electric vehicles, it's going to create sales like a brush fire at the end of a long, hot summer. People who never even knew about EVs are suddenly going to be wondering what it's going to take to buy one. Reason number 3, the value of the Cybertruck. Ultimately, the reason why so many people were able to justify paying more for an iPhone is that they weren't comparing it to another phone. It was a web browsing, music listening, video watching, navigation device that you could also use as a phone. You weren't comparing the iPhone to a flip phone. You were comparing it to a flip phone plus an iPod plus a GPS navigation device plus a small laptop computer. Like the iPhone, the Cybertruck is the highest value, highest utility EV ever created. It has the ability to do everything from being a family hauler to an off-road monster to a contracting money-making machine. Its combination of its bulletproof, rust-proof skin means it's going to last 2 to 3 times longer than a regular vehicle. And its cost to run are a fraction of the cost of an ICE vehicle. It's an armored pickup, SUV, minivan, Jeep, camper with a chauffeur, lasts 30 years and costs you 1/3 of what it costs you to run a regular internal combustion vehicle. And then you'll probably be able to make money with it anytime you're personally not using it. Its value is irresistible because its utility is uncomparable. And lastly, reason number 4, look, the Cybertruck is cool. The iPhone was really cool. Now I get it. Some of the cool factor has worn off over the last 13 years. But when it first came out, the iPhone was a must-have fashion accessory. When it first came out, it made you feel like you were holding a little piece of the future in your hand. I mean, we've gotten used to it now, but back at the beginning, every 6 to 9 months, a new feature, a new release of the iPhone or other smartphones just kept blowing our minds. You kind of felt like if you didn't have an iPhone, you were sort of getting left out of the future. And the good part is that cool factor drove so many sales and so much interest into the smartphone category that it created all kinds of new capital and new companies and new focuses that made the smartphone something that was not only amazing technologically, but it was affordable. The reality is that the Cybertruck being cool or being badass is something that will drive people into the market. And as other automakers see what's happening with the Cybertruck, it will release them to come up with newer, more cool designs. It will help drive the prices down. And it will make it not just a niche to own an EV anymore, but it will make it something that people aspire to. Obviously, eventually, as with smartphones, the wonder will wear off, but not before it brings in the EV revolution. I believe the Cybertruck is the iPhone of the 2020s. I think its combination of design and virality and value and coolness, it'll trigger a tidal wave of interest and sales and ultimately a revolution in electric vehicles. I think the Cybertruck is the pivot point around which the entire automobile industry is going to get turned upside down. And I'm just thankful that I'm going to have a front row seat. Okay, if you like this video, you might like another video that I'll link to here called The Cybertruck Effect, that talks about how Cybertruck Effect is already changing Tesla and the industry. If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing. I'm still trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. It would really help me out. And as always, I read all the comments. So if you write something below, I'll read it, and I appreciate any feedback you have. All right, thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye.